Hello, History 363. So my last lecture on Roman imperialism in the West, I realized that basically that was going to turn into a lecture on the Romans in Spain. But there is one more incident that I think is actually probably worth its own lecture, and that is the Third Punic War. And the Third Punic War is really an enigma, I think, for the history of the 2nd century BC and of Roman Republican imperialism. In that for reasons that sometimes seem, I think, mysterious even to Polybius, the Romans decide in 149 BC to go to war against Carthage, which at this point is a city that poses absolutely no threat to Rome. So for whatever the reasons behind the First Punic War, Carthage is a big, powerful empire with a big, powerful navy, and you could imagine why Rome, another big power in Italy, could come into conflict. In the Second Punic War, you could even argue the Carthaginians almost started and are very, very dangerous to Rome. The Third Punic War is a war of choice, and indeed I find it difficult to explain it as anything other than a war of ideologically driven spite. And in fact, if I had to come up with a recent historical analogy, and of course we should be cautious with historical analogies, I might make it to the 2003 Iraq War, a decision to go to war that made no sense in strategic terms, but was largely driven by sort of the ideology in post 9/11 America. Now, one problem for trying to figure out what happens in the Third Punic War is our sources are terrible. For the First Punic War, of course, we have Polybius Book 1. For the Second Punic War, we have not only Polybius, but also Livy, who gives us a continuous and complete narrative. For the Third Punic War, we are in real trouble, because while Polybius is basically, we have fragments of Polybius, and we also know that Polybius has been a source for Appian. Appian of Alexandria, a sort of younger contemporary of Polybius, who is like Polybius, a Greek with Roman citizenship, who writes a sort of big history of Rome. And Appian's going to be kind of a big gap filler source for us. He himself isn't necessarily a great historian or a dynamic historian. Unfortunately for us, he oftentimes doesn't reveal, or he actually almost never reveals who his sources are, although again we can kind of guess that he's using Polybius for the Third Punic War. But Appian fills a lot of gaps after we lose Livy's narrative in 168 and after Polybius sort of starts to descend into tatters. So our sources aren't great for the Third Punic War, so we can't produce the kind of rich military narrative that we can for, say, the Second Punic War. And nonetheless, the Third Punic War was an event that seems to have jolted Polybius himself into additional literary production. That is, Polybius had planned to end his history with the end of the Third Macedonian War, which sees Rome's hegemony over the East basically complete. But the violence and in some ways the dishonesty of Roman conduct during the Third Punic War seems to have convinced Polybius that he needed to restart his history. And he may have restarted his history with a somewhat more dim view of the moral vision of Rome's imperialism. Now, suffice it to say, Carthage, after the Second Punic War, has been stripped of all of its military really assets. It can't have a fleet other than a small handful of Coast Guard ships. It can't have war elephants. It can't maintain a standing army. It can't make offensive war, period. And it has to ask Roman position before mustering a force to make defensive war. So Carthage is completely ended as a military power. Maybe unsurprisingly, this is really good for Carthage economically. Carthage actually becomes this economically flourishing city that offers to repay the Roman indemnity in 191. The Romans are going to war with Antiochus the Great. The Carthaginians say, oh, you'll probably need money for that. Why don't we pay off this indemnity just right now? We've got the money. We're doing really well. And indeed, every other metric that we can tell in terms of what our sources seem to suggest that Carthage is seen as a really prosperous place. In some ways, the fact that the Romans have forbid the Carthaginians to spend money on, the guns aspect of the guns and butter equation may be really good for Carthage. They can't waste their money on ships or elephants or warfare or military adventures. They can simply focus on themselves. And indeed, always wary, being wary of historical analogies, we might consider it to say the prosperity of Germany or Japan after World War II, which saw their defense expenditures really, really reduced, and yet were able to produce flourishing peacetime economies. In some ways, Carthage is maybe in the same boat. So Carthage is really, really prosperous after the Second Punic War. This may somewhat catch the attentions of the Romans, that Carthaginian defeat is doing great, even if there's really no hints of military power, or, as far as we can tell in Carthage, any desire to revive Carthaginian imperial practices. Now, I suggested that this war should be seen as a war of ideological spite. And I suspect that one reason that the Romans all of a sudden are interested in going to war with Carthage is actually the fact that there is so much dispiriting warfare going on in Spain. That is, the Romans, after 153, when the wars really pick up in Spain, they aren't winning big battles and they aren't enjoying big successes and triumphs. Rather, they're seeing commander after commander humiliated. They're seeing the kind of massacres and atrocities like the kind that Sulpicius Galba commits. And it may be that the dispiriting aspects of Roman imperialism, the slog that's going on in Spain, may make the Romans desire for a war that recalls the glories of a time gone by. And it's notable that two of the key figures who are instigators of this war are actually throwbacks. One is actually not Roman. He's Massinissa, the king of the Numidians, who is blessed with unusually long life even by the dim standards of the ancient world, and actually even by our standards. He's in his 80s. So he is still the king in the 150s. He has turned Numidia into a large, unified, centralized kingdom that is also quite prosperous. But he is interested in taking territory away from Carthage. And he takes advantage of the fact that Carthage isn't supposed to have an army and therefore really can't defend against his territorial ambitions. So Massinissa is one instigator. He also knows that Rome's got his back. He's been a loyal Roman ally in the Second Punic War, and the Romans still owe him a solid. The other figure, who is perhaps the most important instigator on the Roman side, but also a throwback, Cato the Elder, a man who had fought in the Second Punic War, who had been consul in Spain, and who is now Rome's sort of emeritus politician. But Cato the Elder in the 150s comes to advocate for the destruction of Carthage. And Cato is a particularly ideological guy. He's someone who hates sort of the influx of elite Greek culture. He's someone who sort of advocates studiously sort of a Roman vision of agrarian simplicity. He in fact writes an agricultural treatise in Latin, which also survives, an odd example of Latin literature, talking about olive presses and how much to feed your slaves and recipes for cheesecake. But Cato the Elder supposedly has gone to Carthage and returns to the Senate, and while he's speaking in the Senate, drops some figs and says, "Oh, these figs, they were in the pocket of my toga, but they were fresh when I sailed from Carthage, and they're still fresh because Carthage is a prosperous city that's ominously only a few days' sail from Rome." Even though, again, Carthage is not a threat to Rome. And supposedly Cato, in advocating for aggressive military action against Carthage, ends every speech saying, "Carthago delenda est." Whatever I'm talking about. Oh, and one more thing, Carthage must be destroyed. It's a sort of punctuation for Cato. Now, the events that spark the war, or again, more accurately, provide the Romans with an easy war, a pathway for their war, ideological war of choice, is Massinisa's ongoing depredations. The Carthaginians ask permission to Rome to go to war. And the timing is, I think, also interesting because in 151, Carthage has finally paid off its indemnity, which has been paying off over the course of 50 years, 200 talents a year of silver. Now the indemnity's paid off, and this also may be a kind of, in terms of an ideological moment, all of a sudden Carthage is no longer beholden to Rome. All of a sudden it doesn't, the Carthaginian envoys are no longer going to come every year and sort of debase themselves by saying, here is the money that we owe you because you defeated us 50 years ago. So that may be one thing that, again, also kind of triggers Roman ideologues. But there also is a real war that takes place in Africa. Namely, the Carthaginians ask permission to raise an army to fight Massinissa. The Romans say no. And then the Carthaginians, maybe quite reasonably, because the Romans are not acting reasonably at all here, do it anyway. They raise a force, they go off to fight Massinissa, and because the Carthaginians haven't really been practicing their military activities, they lose spectacularly. And indeed, Massinissa, who dies in 150, nonetheless continues to enlarge his realm at the expense of the Carthaginians. Now, this is where the Romans, of course, they can either sort of ignore this disobedience, which they routinely do. There's plenty of instances where the Romans give an order, somebody disobeys it, and the Romans just kind of look the other way. But in 149, I think the ideologues win out, and a decision is made to send not one but two consular armies to Carthage with a declaration of war. And Roman declarations of war are somewhat conditional, but oftentimes the declaration of war will be passed, and that declaration will stand unless there is a last-minute demand. The enemy concedes to Roman demands. So the armies land, and then there are additional Roman demands. Incidentally, at this point, the Carthaginians, who realize they're outclassed, are willing to concede to every single Roman demand that is made of them in 149. You might say they have no choice. There's two Roman consular armies sitting off their coast. And this actually may be a problem to the Romans because they want a war. Now the Carthaginians will say, oh, no, fine, we'll do whatever you want. You surrender. So therefore the Romans make one demand, additional demand, that they know that the Carthaginians will not agree to. And I think this is deliberate. And the demand is that Carthage move its city, raise its current city, take all the buildings down, and move the city 10 miles inland. Carthage, of course, is a coastal city that is prosperous precisely because it has access to the sea. And so this is sort of, the Carthaginians say, of course we're not going to do that. We are actually ready to go to war over this. So again, I think in this, in the fact that the Romans aren't, the Romans could just simply say, okay, we don't like the fact that you went to war with Massinissa, and we're going to threaten you until you back down. But the fact that the Romans are willing to push it to the point that the Carthaginians have to say no, and they make the Carthaginians an offer they know they will refuse, I think suggests that, again, the Romans want a war, and they don't want it for strategic reasons. They want it for ideological reasons. They want a throwback to the glory days of the late 3rd, early 2nd century BC, when the Romans are winning big hegemonic wars. And here's where I think that maybe my Iraq war analogy is not too far off, in that many of you were perhaps very, very small, but even what had happened in Iraq is American troops had been deployed to the border between Kuwait and Iraq, and the diplomacy was you have to let weapons inspectors back in. And guess what? Saddam Hussein let the weapons inspectors back in, and they were doing their inspection, and they weren't finding any weapons of mass destruction, which was the lie that was being told by the Bush administration. There were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so, in theory, the Iraqis were agreeing to everything the Americans wanted. And so then all of a sudden, George W. Bush came up with a new demand that he knew Saddam Hussein was refused. He said, well, Saddam Hussein doesn't go into exile, we'll invade. And they invaded. And of course, I think I've served in the Iraq war. It was a terrible mistake. It was also an ideological war rather than a war driven by any kind of strategic imperatives. And I think the Third Punic War is almost exactly the same. Roman armies are there, they're making demands, their demands are being met, and all of a sudden they make a demand to spark a war because they want the war. They don't actually want armed diplomacy. So in 149, Rome is now at war with Carthage, and maybe the most surprising thing is the Romans can't win. The Carthaginians are well fortified. The Carthaginians, actually probably because of their war against the Numidians, which they've lost, are nonetheless more on a war footing. And you might say that the Roman citizen militia has actually gotten a bit rusty in fighting big hegemonic wars. The Romans are really good at fighting big battles and sieges during the Second Punic War and beyond because they're going and doing it every other year. But now the Roman armies are unable to successfully besiege the Carthaginians. There are a number of minor engagements when Roman contingents are defeated or humiliated. And more seriously, the Romans simply cannot bring the city down. So the war goes from 149 to 148. And in 147, one of the young Roman tribunes who has distinguished himself, Scipio Aemilianus, remember, the son of Aemilius Paulus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, he has he's someone who's shown his courage again in fighting around Carthage. And again, there's a lot of sort of just little small actions and skirmishes as this big long siege drags on. But he's gotten permission to go back to Rome in 147 to run for aedile. So he's starting his path. He's continuing his path up the Cursus Honorum. However, at this point in 147, the Romans are frustrated with the way that the war is going. And it's not lost on them that someone whose actual name is Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, because he's taken the name that comes from his adoptive grandfather, Aemilianus, so Scipio Aemilianus. They said, there's a Scipio Africanus running for aedile right now in Rome, and therefore in the consular election, Scipio is not running in the consular election, but in the consular election, they vote for him. Over the other candidates. And so going to run for aedile, he finds at the end of the day that he has been elected consul, and he is assigned the province of Africa. Here, province at this point still means area of operation, even though we do have, say, our permanent Spanish provinces. Scipio Aemilianus, as it turns out, is a very good general. He finally is able to enter into the city to up the Roman siege, and he, bringing Polybius with him, succeeds in capturing the city in 146 BC. And with the city captured, he enslaves the inhabitants that he captures, and the city itself is burned to the ground. It is deliberately destroyed. And Polybius, who is with Scipio Aemilianus, sees him weeping and quoting bits of Homer as the city burns. And supposedly Scipio Aemilianus says, Polybius says, why are you weeping? We've won this huge victory. Carthage, the great enemy, is no more. And Aemilianus sort of philosophically says, well, I realize that what I'm doing to Carthage at some point in some distant future, some enemy will do to Rome. There is no, power and empire is not eternal. Some of this, of course, is probably Polybius reflecting on his friend's sort of philosophical horizons and perspective. It's also notable, though, when we think about the ideology of Rome's empire, to note that at this point, it isn't as self-confident as maybe it someday will be. Scipio Aemilianus, there in 146, simply sees Rome as a city that right now is powerful, but certainly won't be in the future. There isn't necessarily an ideology of, Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome, or Rome's empire being everlasting. Scipio sees Roman power as still something that is transient and will eventually go away. So that is the end of Carthage, and in a war that, again, is even Polybius thinks is quite dispiriting. He does not see the Romans acting honorably in the way that they conduct their diplomacy. Even if he joins, in fact, suppose he fights a few engagements with Scipio as a kind of adventurer, observer, war correspondent. So while Polybius seems to be an admirer of Scipio, he's not an admirer of the way the Romans act in the lead up to the war. Now, in 146, something else happens that would change Polybius's views on Roman imperialism, and that is a war with the Achaean League that results in the destruction of the city of Corinth. Now, the roots of this war actually are in a different war, and that is the Fourth Macedonian War. So in 150 BC, or 149, around there, a pseudo-Philip emerges in Macedonia. Remember, after the Third Macedonian War, 168, the Perseus is taken to Rome as a captive, the Antigonid dynasty is abolished, and Macedonia is divided up into 4 separate republics, which have to pay tribute to Rome and are forbidden from having certain kinds of connections with one another, including marriage alliances. You can't marry someone who lives in a different republic. So you can see how the Macedonians, who have a long sense of ethnic heritage and identity and awareness, might not be completely happy with this arrangement. And therefore, when this guy whose name is Andriscus, but he calls himself Philip, he suggests that he is a son of Perseus and that he is the rightful heir to the Macedonian throne. And he gets the Macedonians to rally behind him. He defeats a few feeble Roman attempts to stop him. And so finally the Romans actually have to send a full force commanded by a Caecilius Metellus, who subsequently takes the surname Macedonicus. And by 148, this rebellion is pretty handily crushed. Now, this rebellion leads to a decision, and that is to make Macedonia a permanent province. This is going to be the first permanent Roman province in the East that's now going to receive regular annual Roman governors and also have a garrison. So again, we're moving towards the world of Rome having permanent provinces now in both the East and the West. At the same time, there is a diplomatic dispute between Rome and the Achaean League. And at the root of this dispute is the Achaeans are trying to force Sparta to join the Achaean League. And the Romans kind of take Sparta's side. And the Achaeans have actually been being mean to Sparta for much of the 2nd century BC. And the Romans frequently come in and say, oh, don't be so mean to Sparta. And the Achaeans sort of ignore the Romans, and the Romans are, they're too occupied with other things. And it seems that the Achaeans think that this time will be no different. And things basically get out of hand. The Achaeans seem to misunderstand that the Romans are serious this time. And of course, one reason why the Romans are serious is they have troops in the Greek East. They have the forces that are in Macedonia. And so therefore a declaration of war takes place, and the Romans go to war with the Achaean League, simply moving those soldiers down into Greece. And it is a bloodbath. The Achaeans try to hold the line at the Isthmus. The Romans, who are now commanded by a consul named Mummius, they manage to just smash up the Achaean army, and then they take Corinth. And Mummius orders Corinth to be sacked. Its priceless art treasures are captured and shipped back to Rome, and the city of Corinth itself is razed to the ground and left as a desolation, and it will remain a desolation for the next 100 years. A great, ancient, famous Greek city completely annihilated. And of course, it seems that one reason why Mummius does this is he's looking over at Carthage, that Africanus has razed Carthage to the ground just months before, and he says, well, hey, if that's what you do now, this is sort of aristocratic competition getting out of control, if that's what you have to do to make your mark, I guess I've got a city at my mercy, I'll raze it to the ground. So 146 therefore sees this dark turn in Roman imperialism. Carthage is annihilated, Corinth is annihilated, and this somewhat seems to shake Polybius's vision of the Romans and their grand imperial project, which is one reason why he decides to restart his history and take it down to 146 BC. All right, so next time we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Italy in the 2nd century BC. Italy and its discontents, and this will bring us to the brothers Gracchi and the start of Roman civil strife. Hopefully not too prescient an issue. I'll see you soon.